Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Civil Clarity Reports. I'm one of your three hosts, John Noel, along with Marty Espinosa and Jody Kirk. This is our very first podcast, and hopefully, what will be one of many podcasts that we'll be discussing cancel culture, politics, everything related to those topics. Our very first guest is Mitchell Gray, and I'll allow Marty to introduce Mitchell. Marty.
Okay, Mitchell is a friend of mine that I met at Our Lady of Lebanon Catholic Church. Mitchell's a lawyer in Oklahoma City. He's got a military background. He's got the oil and gas background. He has written two books, Mitchell.
Well, four.
Four. And one is on Lebanon. Very good book. He knows about the southern border that we have, narcotics, many other topics. So, Mitchell, if you want to give us a little bio of yourself, that'd be great.
Well, first, thank you, Marty. So I'm honored to be your guest here on the podcast. Thank you for having me. As Marty said, kind of have the background he stated. Like I said, I've got the first book is I heard you were going on jihad. So that kind of started this literary career, quote unquote. I found myself just before 9/11. And if I go to, I'm not trying to go too long, so I don't want to kind of just ramble on. So he asked that. I think it's just kind of important to have a little bit of this part. So right before 9/11, I was about 40 years old. I'd already served in the military, but I was completely out. So I was not in Guard or Reserve. So, I'm an attorney in Oklahoma City, two kids, they're in middle school. So I kind of was living sort of what I call a very average type life, home, married, two kids, coach Little League baseball and softball. So very, very common how things go with typical homes. But I always had kind of an intellectual itch, particularly I was a history major. And I'd been in the military during the first Gulf War, so I had a lot of interest, just lifelong in history, the Middle East. Well, my wife teaches chemistry here at the University of Oklahoma, and she kept mentioning there's a lot of foreign students, and they wanted to know if I did immigration law. So I said, I'm kind of interested in learning some new areas of law. That sounds interesting. We live near the university. We like the university community. So I started practicing some immigration law and specialized really with students because here they were. I'm right next to a major university, and so I just started, handling what I could and meeting the students and learning about that. And then I just, for some reason, got the idea, hey, why not learn a language, to help with this? And here in Oklahoma, we're almost a de facto border state, so there's a lot of immigration attorneys that they advertise they speak Spanish. I said, well, I'll just try to be a little bit off the beaten path. And the person that originally kind of had suggested that there would be immigration cases, which was a friend of my wife, he was from Kuwait. So I said, you've always been interested in the Middle East, and then there was the first Gulf War. Just maybe you can learn Arabic. I mean, don't ask me why I got that mind. So I started doing that, and he invited me to start meeting him in the Norman Mosque, and he would start teaching me the rudiments of Arabic. Well, little did I know that in 2 months that 9/11 would occur. And of course, like everybody, just really stunned over that. And I knew we were at war, and I thought, I want to get in this fight. This is our Pearl Harbor, my generation's Pearl Harbor. My dad was a combat vet. Most of my family had served in the military, so that was kind of an instinct. I'm 40 years old. I'm already discharged. What can I do? So I kind of dedicated the Arabic language learning to getting into this fight. And I sort of envisioned myself that I would eventually maybe, get in on the intel side, CIA, FBI, something of that nature. Yeah. So anyway, so after 9/11 and that, I just kind of stayed with the Arabic and this book, I think you can see it here. It's now only available on digits. But these guys contacted me right after 9/11 to help somebody that had been arrested at the mosque. And they claimed it was on an immigration violation. But it was very clear to me early on that it had something to do with 9/11, that it was not an immigration problem. And it turned out it had a lot to do with 9/11 because it involved a guy that was with Zacharias Moussaoui, who at that time was being labeled, as the 20th hijacker. And he was an OU student, and they had gone to Minnesota. So a lot of people think that was one of the last best chances we had to stop 9/11. They arrested Moussaoui up in Minnesota along with this guy. His name's Hussein Alatas. And Moussaoui had been in the Norman Mosque for several months and recruiting people for jihad. And, so getting into that and realizing that the story they were telling me was not true, got kind of sucked early into the entire 9/11 story because of Moussaoui. Moussaoui was, a key factor, and we arrested him. We didn't search his laptop. And so there was a lot of after action reports on 9/11 that, went back to Moussaoui. So that's kind of how I really got into this. And then eventually, I know Marty, it wants me to feature Lebanon. When I'd been in the military in the early 80s, or I was training for infantry school when the Marine barracks were bombed back in 83. And I was 100% convinced as a very young man. I thought, well, we're going to go to war over this. You can't blow up and kill 240 Americans like that. Plus, we were coming off the Iranian Revolution, which was very relevant to Lebanon. So those days in the early 80s with the Cold War and events that were going on in Lebanon, we didn't realize that the road to 9/11 goes way back. I mean, it wasn't something that just came up in the year 2000. And so ultimately, as I went along studying Arabic, being involved in the military, deploying to Iraq, I just continued to read and look into this. And then roads kept leading back to Lebanon. So I was very interested in that, and particularly the Christian resistance that went on in their civil war. So I finally just decided that nobody's really written in America very good books about Lebanon. So I wanted to kind of write something that the Lebanese people would say he gets it, and something that would educate Americans to a part of what became 9/11, the war on terror, and the situation we're in that, in my opinion, hardly anybody knows about.
Wonderful. That's
I'll stop there.
yeah. And to me, what is really the reason I'm so excited about you being on is most Americans have no idea how the impact of some place like Lebanon and all the terrorist camps that are there against Israel are going to impact us here. We're not taught that history here. And maybe you can enlighten us with the history of Lebanon, because I know that Lebanon has had all kinds of occupiers and religions are in there. There's like three major ones. And maybe you can enlighten us all here, and then we can pass that on. And what do you guys think?
And like I said, feel free to ask specific questions. If I don't know, I'll be honest about it. So I'm happy to do that. In light of what you said, Marty, in the book, I quote the book. This is the cover of it here. It's called Sons of Resistance, Bashir Gamayel, Ali Hassan Salamah, Freewheeling and Open Beirut, What Shaped Modern Lebanon. It has an amazing timeline. I've read most of the books on Lebanon, and some of them have timelines, none like this. So I spent a lot of time on the timeline. That way people could just go to that and get the history in very detailed amount. I have a glossary of the important families and individuals in Lebanon, as well as the important places. So Lebanon's very important geopolitically, historically, and in religion, though it is a small country geographically. And it's fair to point out that Christians in Lebanon have always looked to America, as a place of refuge, and hopefully that America could be somewhat of a protector. But it's been a mixed bag. So the hero of the story really is Bashir Gamayel, who and I don't know how much everybody knows about him. I mean, most Americans don't. You guys obviously are much more attuned to history and events.
I don't know anything about him. I've never heard his name before. So,
well, Bashir Gemayel, I picked. He's a contemporary Lebanese. I mean, so we're not going back in history. The short answer is he was elected president during the Civil War in 1983. And several weeks after he was elected, but before he was sworn into office, as often happens in a bloody place like Lebanon, he was assassinated and blown up in a bomb by Syrians, and probably with the blessings of the Syrian government. Bashir Gemayel was also an attorney, and he came from a prominent mountain family on Mount Lebanon. His father was the person who founded what's called the Kata'ib Party. Kata'ib means battalions in Arabic, but some people have heard I think it's the Greek word phalange, the Phalange Party. So the Western media, like if you go back and you read New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, and about the Civil War in Lebanon, they frequently talk about the Phalange Party, Phalange. That's the same thing as the Kata'ib Party, and his father had founded that. They were a well-known mountain family going back for centuries. But he was a very important figure because he was the leader of what was called the Christian resistance in Lebanon. And the civil war there had broken out in 1975, but of course its roots go back long before that. But as Marty alluded to, it became very important because a lot of the terror groups that preceded Al-Qaeda, in other words, if we look at the timeline of modern terror in the Middle East, and yes, it goes without saying, there's terror groups outside the Middle East, but we're kind of concentrating on those from the Middle East, and that probably is the largest concentration of them, if truth be known. We have to look. It's important to know the history of those groups and to see how they morphed into entities like Al-Qaeda. So Beirut had become probably the key city for these groups to operate. And the reason for that is the other Arab countries, despite the public sentiments they might put forward, they did not want the PLO, Yasser Arafat's umbrella group. Everybody's familiar with PLO, right?
Yep.
The PLO, they're an umbrella group with other groups in it. So PLO is just sort of the general name. Like if we said Major League Baseball, there's not a team called Major League Baseball, but the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Giants, they're all Major League Baseball. So I'm a baseball fan, so I make that analogy. So there's no group called the PLO. There's groups within the PLO, but everybody's familiar with the term PLO, and everybody remembers Yasser Arafat. His group was Fatah, and they had started back in the 50s. They became the most important and the best funded, and probably the just overall the most powerful Palestinian group that was engaging in both terror and politics when they could. And of course, they needed a home because they don't have their Palestinian home, so they would operate kind of where they could find cooperation. And they moved into Jordan, and they were up because a lot of the Jordanians are Palestinians, so they were operating in Jordan. And in 1970, in a very crucial event, the guerrillas of the PLO had become so powerful they were threatening King Hussein's entire kingdom, and so he finally realized he would have to turn on his on his fellow Arabs, and he unleashed his military and just blew them right out of Amman, Jordan. Went into the camps. They slaughtered lots of people. So it was Arab on Arab killing, and that became known as Black September. You may have heard that title in reference to the Munich Olympic.
Yeah.
There was a very good movie by I think Spielberg about Munich. So Black September, that referred to the bloody eviction from Jordan. They left Jordan. The only place they could go was Beirut because it was an open, democratic, free city. And they had already established a lot of bases there anyway. And there were a lot of Palestinians that fled there after the 1948 war. So Lebanon sort of became what was called a state within a state. And that is the PLO went in and they organized the camps, they radicalized them, they armed them. And, this is part of the Cold War too. So it's not just, Palestinians or Arabs. I mean, you've got the Soviets, the Chinese, Cuba, North Korea. I mean, you have these East-West dimensions pouring into it, taking different sides here. So the PLO is getting most of the booty and most of the funding and becoming very powerful. So they were.
Who exactly were they getting most of their funding from?
Well, they would get it from the Gulf Arabs, almost a form of blackmail, kind of like almost think of a mob that, hey, you need to buy some insurance so you don't have a fire. So a lot of the wealthy Gulf people would give them money so they would lay off their area, and they would get some funding. They got funding from the Soviet Union, and so those were probably their main areas of funding. They generated some of their own funds because they were also really a criminal organization. I mean, they did all kinds of activities to raise funds, and you see that today with Hezbollah and hey, ISIS was selling stolen art, and stolen gasoline. So they all come up with legal and illegal ways to obtain funding. Well,
can I ask you a question on that one?
Yeah, please do.
What about the $35 billion that the United States sent into the country? Where was that money going this whole time?
Where?
In Lebanon.
Oh, well, what time period?
You had to ask me, didn't you? I
Well,
have it here somewhere. I'll hold that question until I find it.
Well, I mean, the U.S. is always gives money to Lebanon. They still give money to the Lebanese army and things of that nature. They do a lot of stuff through the State Department, USAID. So we've always given money to most of these, to a lot of the Arab states with that. But certainly the PLO didn't lack for money and arms. Beirut was ringed with refugee camps. So when they became radicalized and armed, it was like a military envelopment around the entire city. So the tensions that developed were not really purely religious. They had to do more with how much should a state allow a non-state actor to conduct operations from their territory. So the problem would be the PLO would launch attacks on Israel from Lebanese sovereign territory, and Israel retaliates. And They usually retaliate harder than what the action was. So, for example, in 1969, when the hijacking kind of came into vogue, I think it was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, another group within the PLO. They hijacked an El Al Israeli jet. Well, Israel knew that they were based in Beirut, and they'd warned the government of Lebanon to keep these guys under control, and they didn't feel they did. So Israel went in broad daylight, and they blew up like 4 or 5 Beirut jets at Beirut airport, to kind of show like this is what happens when you let these people operate in your territory. So the easy answer would be don't let them operate from the territory. But here was the problem. Lebanon is so divided. Marty mentioned earlier 3 major religious groups. Lebanon has a very unusual form of government. It's one of the few in the world like it. It's called a confessional system. And it came about in 1943 as an oral agreement between Maronite Christian elites and Sunni elites. And they simply agreed that each side would give up something. The Christians would give up their traditional support they got from France. And the Sunnis said, we will no longer seek to have this greater Syria or this greater Arab state. And then they created a power sharing agreement to where the president would always be a Maronite Christian, and the prime minister would be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament would be a Shia. And then various other positions were doled out proportionately to some of the other Christians, like the Greek Orthodox, and of course the Druze. The Druze play a big role in Lebanon. So it was this power sharing agreement, but it couldn't hold up to the stresses that developed in the world after World War II. The first one being the rise of Nasser in Egypt. That really brought what was called Arab nationalism to fever pitch by the late 50s, and including in Lebanon. And so particularly the Sunni Muslims were like, this agreement's not fair. We need more representation. We need more power. And the Christians have too good of a deal. There was the feeling there were more Muslims than there were Christians at that time. And there hasn't been a census in Lebanon since like 1932, because nobody really wants to know what the truth is, because it affects how things are represented. So it got so bad in 1958 that a little mini civil war broke out, and they called the U.S. military in under the Eisenhower Doctrine. That became important because that was the first time in modern times that the U.S. went to the Middle East in a military deployment-like situation. Now, that turned out not to be a very bloody one, but it was the first time that we were going to intervene in these complex Middle Eastern affairs. But that kind of was a portending future events in Lebanon. Well, the 1967 war is so important. I always tell people you cannot understand the modern Middle East without a good understanding of the 1967 Six-Day War, because this was considered the greatest tragedy in modern Arab history, because they believed under Nasser's leadership that they finally had the strength and the ability to defeat Israel, who they considered the Zionist entity. And as the war clouds gathered, Israel just determined that there was no way out. There was going to be war. So they decided they would take the initiative. So on June 5th, 1967, in a very, very strong surprise military operation, Israel went in, they knocked out the Egyptian Air Force in the morning. And at that point, it just kind of stunned everybody. It stunned Nasser. And within 6 days, they had defeated the whole Arab coalition, just rolled them up. They went in, they reclaimed, Jerusalem, and they had seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai, and, areas like that. And of course, that shocked the whole world. And to this day, this is important because like Obama was always saying, there can't be peace in the Middle East until Israel goes back to pre-1967 borders. In other words, there are people out there, they want Israel to give up everything that they won in 67. But the Israeli position is they have to have it for security, like the Golan Heights. So Israel views a lot of this as, for their security. And they say, well, we can't give up all our security, and we won this in war. And that's the way that it goes. So these issues still remain very important to this day, because we all know the U.S. has been trying to broker some sort of overarching peace in that region our whole lives, and they've never been successful. They'll sign interim agreements, or there'll be this or that. But at the end of the day, as we sit here right now, what's going on? Well, just the other day, 38 missiles are launched from southern Lebanon into Israel. Israel has retaliated. Hamas is strong. Hezbollah is practically dominating Lebanon, and that's just simply a Shia version of Hamas. So these groups are still operating, and it still is affecting policy.
Mitch,
and we hear.
Can I intervene?
Yeah.
Can I
Please.
interject here? Why is what you're telling us about this last part about the missiles going over and the retaliation in Lebanon, and why is that important to Americans to know the history of Lebanon and that region?
Well, I mean, I think any time that you deal from a position of knowledge, you deal from a position of strength. Likewise, a position of ignorance, it would be weakness. You know, that conflict over there has bedeviled even the United States, primarily because of oil and because of the Cold War. Well, the funny thing is, people say the Cold War is ended, but has it? I think it's really just more shifted. I mean, the Soviet Union is no longer in existence, but you're still dealing with a major Eastern communist power in China, and you're still dealing with entities like Iran and now radical Islam. So we aren't we are not always on a front line with troops, although we have been. So this conflict does not stop. However, Israel has largely been a U.S. ally. They pursue their own interest. We pursue ours, but obviously there's been a close relationship. Israel does have a powerful lobby here. And so it does have political implications for politicians on who they're supporting in this. But the U.S. also tries to be a leader in the international sphere. And we live in an era where everybody wants to be seen, that they're promoting peace and they're promoting, that these problems be solved. So there's just no way for the United States to just take a completely isolationist standpoint. Now,
Okay.
yeah,
Did I even go ahead, Jody?
yeah, go ahead.
A comment to that. Okay, is what this comes down to, because I'm just regular Joe Blow walking down the street. Okay, I hear a little bit on the news about Lebanon or about the Middle East and the fighting that's going on there. And the question is why do I give a rat's behind if they body slam each other? And the answer you came up with a second ago on that was because it affects the political parties here and where the political party is getting its funding from for its campaigns. Now, is that what I got out of that just a second ago? Because is what
Well,
that comes down to is they're the only ones.
I think that's part of it. I mean, that's just sort of a practical reality on why the issue is important. But as I also pointed out, the United States does have geopolitical interests in the Middle East and in that region. Historically, we have wanted to keep all the shipping lanes. I mean, it's very important geographically in terms of global trade and, of course, oil. Most of the world's oil goes through the choke points that are in the Middle East or nearby. And we've always had the policy to keep those lanes open and clear. So when there's conflict in the Middle East, you always have the threat that somebody will close those lanes or the prices go way up. We've seen that in history. Yes, things could be less intense about that if America would accept its oil largesse. But here politically, we have people domestically that don't want the U.S. to produce oil. They want to jump ahead in history into this Green New Deal and keep the hydrocarbons in the ground. But if you do that, you're going to be, again, relying more heavily on Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern producers. So the oil factor has probably been the number one factor in Middle East policy historically, because you may or may not be aware, in 1945, right as the war was ending, Franklin Roosevelt entered into an oil for security deal with the King of Saudi Arabia, and every president has honored that more or less. So we've been tethered to the most conservative Islamic regime on earth, and that has created a lot of tensions because they have always had to take a position against Israel, and the United States doesn't. And so that creates great tension in these relationships at all times. So the whole idea of a Jewish state in Israel has just been a matter of contention, and Americans may not like it, but
Hey, I had a question, Mitchell. I was curious to know, would you say that President Trump's stance and policies, he obviously seemed to be a lot more pro-Israel than the previous administration before him and the current one. Was that a positive for the relationships that we did have with other Arabic countries, maybe other countries in general? Or was there negative aspects to that? How was his stance and policies on Israel effective or not effective?
Well, I can't say that I think any president has ever been extremely effective there, because we've never been able to achieve the ultimate goal. And that's because what does everybody want? Do they want what's called the two-state solution, where you're going to have a Palestinian state next to the Israeli state? Or are you going to have greater Israel, in which the Palestinians have full rights and citizens? They don't even agree among themselves for it. I think that one thing Trump did that I do think was a good idea to try was, all the other U.S. presidents tended to follow the two-state solution and say, let's get the Palestinians to the table and let's try to get everybody to the table and hammer out this two-state solution. Trump just said, okay, this hasn't worked. It's not going to work. So he just bypassed the Palestinians and said, we're just going to go straight to these Arab countries and convince them that it's in their long-term interest that they work out deals with Israel. It will help them for trade. It will help them for energy. It will help them for security. And really, he was really isolating the Palestinian side, instead of embracing it and massaging it and trying to get everybody on board. So based on the failure of all the other presidents and policies, I think the early signs were there was some success with that. People tell me that Saudi Arabia and Israel are closer than ever, and that they're such an important part to the overall Middle East puzzle that if Saudi Arabia entered into a treaty with Israel, you would then say, okay, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, two of the most powerful states that have done it, that the others will, kind of like a domino theory there, that then everybody else will kind of fall in line. I'm not saying that would happen, but it would certainly be a huge thing. But of course, it would have tremendous implications on the Arab Street, because the hatreds and feelings towards some towards Israel is so intense, it's so emotional, you can't use logic. And it's to the point, people that don't have energy, they don't want to buy gas from Israel, even though it's cheap and it's just gas, right? But they just can't be associated with it because it's from Israel. So you're fighting, it's almost in the DNA. So the governments are very reluctant to be the one to do that, because they would fear intifadas and uprisings. And, obviously the region has a history of violence and assassination. So you see a lot of unofficial progress being made. But I mean, let's face it, it's the most complicated place in the world. And I don't think anybody can sit here and say they've got a solution to it, because smarter people than me have been working on it forever. And, sometimes, to be honest, I don't know if there really is going to be a solution while anybody right now is alive on Earth. I think these hatreds will just have to burn out over many, many, many generations into the future, to be honest. So I think in the meantime, just a pragmatic thing, everybody should try to just say, hey, let's normalize relations as much as we can. But as we see, as what's going on from southern Lebanon, this is what was happening back in the 60s. The attack on Israel from southern Lebanon brought in the responses, and then Israel wound up invading. So there's people right now saying, hey, war is inevitable again between Israel and Lebanon. And of course, when you say Lebanon, you really have to say the Christians in Lebanon, they don't support Hezbollah. They don't support this. So, what do? They wind up leaving. More and more they leave. They go to Europe, they come here. And that is a segue into Iranian policy, which has been to encourage Syrian refugees to flood into Lebanon. And I asked today, in preparation for this program, I talked to a very prominent Lebanese person, and I told him what I was going to do. And I said, what would be some things that you would want me to mention? And she said, refugees. I mean, and of course, it's a known fact from the Syrian civil war, over 1 million refugees have piled into a country that's broke. Lebanon is teetering on complete economic crisis. They can't handle refugees, and here they've got them. And so what happens is this is cheap labor. So people will hire the Syrian refugees because they're cheaper than Lebanese workers. So now the unemployment rate of Lebanese goes higher, and it makes the situation worse. So there's not good regulations, and there's not good continuity in handling the refugees. And again, the refugee problem, that was the problem with the Palestinians in 1948. They flooded into Lebanon, and they ultimately created, an army, an armed camp in Lebanon. They have a, yeah, go ahead.
Question. Who's in charge of the 12 refugee camps? Who controls what goes on there?
Mainly.
Pardon?
Set them up in 1948, so it's primarily under international control. But you know what? You still have the UN force down there. They're called UNIFIL. So you have a UN presence that's been there. But what does the UN do that's effective, right?
Yeah.
Vietnam.
Listen, the big problem in Lebanon today is Hezbollah. Because when the civil war ended, you have to understand all these groups, Druze, Christians, they all had their own militias, they all had their own private armies. And when the civil war was settled in the early 90s, they got together in Taif, Saudi Arabia, and they hammered out an agreement, and they disarmed all the militias. But a huge mistake was made. They did not disarm Hezbollah, because they defined them as, quote, a resistance group, that they were there to protect Lebanon from Israel. Well, not only have they remained an armed group, but they've become more than just a terrorist group, more than a militia. I mean, they really have the status of a regular army. I mean, they're armed to the teeth with silkworm missiles. They are supported by Iran, who's supported by China and Russia. So they're getting all kinds of hardware. They have engaged in drug trafficking and money laundering in 4 continents, and including in the United States, to raise money. And they are a radical Shia entity that wants an Islamic state in Lebanon, and it's diametrically opposed to what the Christian of Lebanon would want. Lebanon always was a special place for Christians. It just was. There's not many places in the Middle East we can say that. So to the one gentleman's questions why he should give a rat's what, I would say that part of this is not just geopolitical per se, but part of it is, do we want to see the last organized and well-developed units of Christianity in that region be completely forced out, and for that to become Islamicized? Beirut is a very important international port city. So we just have to look at it also from a cultural standpoint. Bashir Gemayel, as I mentioned earlier, his speeches were very rousing. And he used to say, he warned America back in the 80s about what was going to happen. He said, your enemy is our enemy, but we don't have any oil to sell you, but we've got civilization and we've got morals. And you ought to be on our side, because we should have the same civilization and the same morals. But the U.S. chose a short-term strategy because of its oil policies and Cold War policies. And now today, you see a much, much weaker Christian resistance in Lebanon that's probably facing extinction at the hands of, Hezbollah, which is really very, very closely tethered to Iran. So I would say, do we want that? And I would say that that we don't. But I mean, that's just, obviously I've kind of developed my own biases because I've spent so much time looking at this, and I identify and have for a long time. I identify with the Christian.
Well, guys, I think about reached our limit here. So
yeah.
So thank you, Mitchell, very much.
My pleasure. Christians in Lebanon, personally.
Show us the book you wrote on that one more time.
Oh, okay.
Kind of leave it up for a second. I like people to see that. pick it up, where can they find that?
Well, you can just order it on Amazon. It's that simple.
Okay, I've been reading the book, guys, and it's excellent. It's excellent. A lot of information. Thank you. Thanks again for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thank
Great.
you.
All right.
God bless.
Thank you.
Hey, keep New Mexico safe. I love going to New Mexico. So, all right. Good night.
Okay, God bless.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this first episode, inaugural edition of Civil Clarity Reports. We will see you next time.
Have a good night.
Okay, guys.